proposal in Washington seeks to raise legal cannabis age to 25. But are they interpreting science correctly? You guys be the judge. In 1996, California was the first state to legalize medical marijuana. Following this, 40 states, along with the District of Columbia, have legalized the medical application of cannabis. Additionally, the District of Columbia and 24 states have allowed cannabis recreational or adult use, although 4 have yet to launch their commercial retail markets. In all of these instances, as with alcohol, the age allowed to use is 21. But in Washington, there's a bill that specifically proposes raising the minimum legal age of sale for cannabis products with more than 35% THC concentration to up to 25 years. There would be an exemption for qualified patients and designated medical providers. House Bill 2023, addressing, quote, high THC cannabis products, was introduced in Washington State House Committee on the Regulated Substances and Gaming by Representative Lauren Davis, a Democrat of Shoreline, and Tom Dent, Republican of Moses Lake, on January 11th, with a public hearing on January 16th. They argue that high THC cannabis products presents both physical and mental risks that need to be addressed. They say, today there's no legal limit on the potency of psychoactive element THC in cannabis concentrates. Cannabis vape oils, dabs, and shatter are regularly sold with a THC potency of nearly 100%, which they claim is a 10-fold increase in potency from when cannabis was legalized in 2012. They say that these concentrated products are different and, quote, dangerous. The cannabis industry has changed considerably since cannabis was legalized, Dent said. The legislation is needed to address the ever-changing market and put some measures in place to protect cannabis users and, of course, our youth. At Cannabis Business Times, they report that back in November of 2012 in Washington, along with Colorado, became the inaugural states to legalize cannabis for adult use. Starting in 2014, both states initiated sales of adult use cannabis for individuals 21 and over. Since then, the additional 18 states have adopted similar legislation. But if the bill passes, that age will raise to 25. Numerous advocates for legalization in the U.S. argue that age limit for cannabis sales should align with that of alcohol sales. However, legislators in various state governments holding more conservative views have advocated for raising the cannabis age limit to 25 years. They justify this by citing that human brain development continues up to that age. While the brain ceases growing by size in your early teens, it doesn't complete its development and maturation until the late 20s. The prefrontal cortex, which is located behind the forehead, is among the last regions to fully mature. It plays a key role in abilities such as planning, prioritizing, decision-making. There's some evidence that cannabis can alter the teenage brain and that one should wait until adulthood to enjoy these substances. The bill's sponsor argue that reasoning is backed by the work of scientists from Washington State University and the University of Washington based on a November 2020 report called Cannabis Concentration and Health Risks. The paper stated that, quote, use of cannabis with high THC concentrates increases the chances of developing cannabis use disorder or addiction to cannabis, particularly among adolescents. It also says that daily cannabis use, particularly of high-potency products, increases the risk of developing a psychiatric disorder like schizophrenia and is related to earlier onset symptoms compared to people who do not use cannabis. While such language is included in the bill, that David and Dent kept out the part that such evidence is talking about the effects of THC on those between the ages of 14 and 19, not 20 and 25, which is the age of adults that would be affected by this bill if it passed. The bill would also require Washington Department of Health to create voluntary training programs for retail cannabis staff on potential health and safety effects and requires the University of Washington's Addictions, Drug, and Alcohol Institute to put into effect guidelines for healthcare providers and patients that were, quote, deemed at risk of severe complications for cannabis use. Well, you guys, another day, another crazy idea, continuing some marijuana mania. I can't wait to hear what my fellow correspondents think about this one. Let's go ahead and kick it right back over to you guys. Tell me what you think. This is Carmen Sacramento for High at Night.
Now, this worries me a bit just because of the fact that they don't have any type of medical basis to make the type of claims that they did for their reasoning in this. And not to mention, it's a bipartisan bill, and it's coming out of Washington State, which is one of the first states to have adult use programs in place and had a very robust medical system prior. And so that's why this concerns me, is because a bunch of these other states are going to take this seriously and try to replicate this in other states. And that's why this big piece of legislation concerns me, because they don't have any basis. And especially these Republicans, they need to be more about freedom. And if you're trying to age restrict someone based off of that, you're not about freedom. You're all about control. And so they just need to let, if you can go to fight in war, you can let people take whatever substances they want. And that's just the bottom line to it.
And that you brought up a really good point, Jason. I mean, why is it that our country is okay with putting a semi-automatic gun in somebody's hands when they're 18 years old and shipping them around the world? But we have to be really careful about whether or not they try this plant that's never killed anybody before.
Yeah, and just so you know, I don't.
And also, let's not forget the big drinking culture that's within our military and law enforcement systems.
Mm-hmm. And I have no problem with our government putting firearms in 18-year-olds and sending them off to war. I don't have any problem with that. What I have a problem with is them restricting people's choices of what they want to do when we live in a free country. That's my problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as a conscientious objector that doesn't think we've had a just war in the United States since World War II, and has watched our country insert itself militarily, either actively, covertly, or through the providing of arms in pretty much most theaters of operation in global conflict, I think that we're tethering this conversation to this interesting concept that we discussed last week on this show around this notion that 18-year-olds are allowed to bleed for this country and therefore they should have other freedoms. Mm-hmm. I think that while that continues to be the law of the land, I don't know that if we take a step back from it, is actually really good. Like, yes, we have to have a standing army. Yes, this is a world where violence is probably never going to be eliminated. And young men dying because of the country's policies has not always served our greater interests. I'm really conflicted, and so I'm really glad that you brought this article today, because it's one of these ones where I don't just have a ready-made, snappy response ready for reels, because I'm a parent and I'm also pro-cannabis. And I think the science is interesting. We now know that people's brains don't fully develop until 25. And because of that, I've changed my position in respects to the granular perspective I have about the Second Amendment. And I don't think young men should have access to assault weapons with a 30-round mag until they're over 25, because the brain is still forming. The challenge that I have with this law is the notion that changing the age of access is going to change the behavior of young adults, men and women, because my perspective is that they're probably going to access cannabis anyway, and that this is another gift back to the trap. Mm-hmm. And so I, in theory, love the idea that policy is updating to accommodate scientific information. But I think 18 to 25-year-olds are going to use cannabis whether they can get it in a store or not. And my greatest concern for this generation is not cannabis, it's fentanyl.
Mm-hmm. And, on Yarrow, you made really good points, because I agree with you. If they would have said that they were changing the age limit based off of those reasons, those medical reasons, as far as the brain development portion, I could accept that, and it could be more palatable to me. But because they want to use this reefer madness, there's too strong THC and this and it gets people schizophrenia and this and that. All they're doing is using the reasons of nothing but reefer madness, and that's why I'm this dead in the water. Use some real science if you're gonna come across these types of policies.
35% THC, that's just such an arbitrary number that, I mean, mm-hmm. No vapes, no more concentrates. Like,
it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and all it does is, just like your point, Rico, it just feeds the trap, because people are going to want those products regardless if they can purchase them in a store or not.
So I'm not Rico. I'm Yarrow motherfucking
sorry.
Cooper.
I'm sorry,
And Mandy,
Yarrow.
when
My
they
bad.
ship these young men and women across the world, they don't give them semi-automatic weapons. They give them automatic weapons. That said, you two are incredibly insightful and add to this conversation, both on your perspective as a parent, as an advocate, and both as operators. And I think you're right, Jason. They didn't tether it to the science. And we have to be careful in this industry to not let this reefer madness 2.0 and 3.0 creep into the way in which policy is modified. And it's really unfortunate because when they put these THC limits, what they're basically saying, unless they have a different guideline for their medical, is that patients who actually need really high THC limits are going to have an access to that type of medication. And so I'm not so worried about the kid that wants a 92% hot dog water vape cartridge. I'm worried about the person that needs very high THC to reduce the symptoms they're having from chemotherapy. You know, there's this, I'm going to keep going back to it. I'm going to keep going back to the patient who needs high THC or access to medicine for chemotherapy, whether I'm railing about Wisconsin or we're talking about Washington. Either way, the only way you get a W and not an L in cannabis is if we still remember that there is this medicinal, this homeostasis, this wellness component. And who are we, with our lack of full understanding of the endocannabinoid system, to say that there's this arbitrary limit? And I think you really hit the nail on the head with that one, Jason.
You know what, too, Yarrow? I even respect it more if they said, hey, you know what? We're going to treat cannabis like rental cars. And therefore, you can only purchase cannabis if you're 25, since you can only rent a car once you're 25 anyway. So, like that to me would make more sense than what they're saying now. But, you know, on that, we're going to go to a commercial. We're going to be right back.
The hurts of hash.
Exactly.